Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Pod TV network, where we're going to be discussing medical and science. And today, our topic is going to be something very interesting that you might be familiar with. This is the Florida measles tragedy. And with that, today, I have a very special guest, a medical doctor who knows about infectious diseases, and he's going to discuss what are vaccines, why you should have them, and what is measles and why you should avoid it. And with that, we're going to bring in Dr. Michael PATMAS. Dr. PATMAS, welcome to Medicine and Science.
Hi, Nick. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a privilege to do this and to communicate with your audience. I'm very honored. I just want to briefly introduce myself because it's important to know who's putting out information. We live in a world now where there are a lot of self-proclaimed experts, and I think it's important to know who is actually speaking to you. My name is Michael PATMAS. I am a board-certified internal medicine physician. I also have added qualifications in infection control and hospital epidemiology. I'm licensed in 12 states. I still practice medicine. I've spent many years as a chief medical officer and also as a chief of infection control in hospitals. And so understanding how infections spread is within my area of expertise. I have no conflicts of interest. No one is paying me to do this. I don't have any interest in any pharmaceutical companies. I don't own stock in any pharmaceutical companies. I have absolutely no conflict of interest. I want to talk to you today about a catastrophe that I'm sure you've all probably heard about on the news, what's going on in Florida and around the rest of the United States. Measles, a disease that was considered eradicated from the Americas in 2000, has returned, and it's returning with a vengeance. And this is tragic, and it's totally preventable. Let me tell you a couple of the key points I want to make. The first is that measles, like smallpox, it can be eradicated. It's only found in humans. It's not found in any other host reservoir and any other animal. It's only maintained in humans. So if we vaccinated sufficiently, we could eliminate measles from the face of the earth, as we did with smallpox. What is a vaccine? A vaccine is a substance that induces an immune response. And there's many, many different kinds of vaccines. The measles vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine. It takes a little tiny piece of the virus, introduces it into you, you develop an immune response, and then you can ward off the virus. The vaccine for measles is highly effective. 2 doses gives you 95% protection from acquiring measles, and it's lifelong. Even 1 dose will give you 92% protection in the setting of an acute epidemic or acute outbreak. But the important point is that measles theoretically can be eradicated from no one should ever get measles, really, if we were to achieve high enough levels of vaccination. We did really great in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and we managed to eliminate measles from the Americas just until the last few years, and it is now back. And the reason it's back is because there's been a decline in vaccination rates. The anti-vax movement is so discouraging people from taking vaccines that the disease is coming back because vaccination rates are down. And in Florida, the issue is that the Florida Surgeon General gave incorrect advice last week when he told there's an outbreak in Broward County. And he sent out a message to residents of Florida, and they said, if your child was exposed to measles, don't worry, you can send them to school. That's wrong, 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 wrong. That will incite a much greater outbreak. That is a total disregard for infection control isolation procedures. So what is measles? Well, measles is a viral infection that only infects humans. It's incredibly contagious. If you're unvaccinated and exposed to measles, you have about a 90% chance that you will get measles. people haven't seen, I'm old enough to remember measles before we had vaccines. And nowadays, people haven't seen me. Most American doctors have never seen measles. They don't know what it looks like. And most people, it's just a rash and a cold. Oh, no, no. Measles, much worse than that. About 1 in 10 children who get measles will get measles in their ear, which can lead to deafness, permanent, irreversible deafness. About 1 in 20 will get measles pneumonia, bad enough that they can end up in a hospital on a ventilator, damaging their lungs. About 1 in 1,000 will get encephalitis, which is swelling of the brain and can lead to permanent, irreversible neurological injury, including a thing called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, which is a fatal disease, leads to seizures, convulsions, dementia, and coma and death. This is in children, and that happens to about 1 in 1,000 children with measles. Overall, about 3 children per 1,000 infected will die. Measles kills people. It's so contagious that every person with measles will, on average, infect 12 to 18 others. So if you multiply that out, 1 person affecting 18 others, each of those 18 in turn infects another 18. Here's the math. It goes from 1 to 324 to 5,832 to 104,926, just in four series, 4 sequential contacts. That's how rapidly measles can spread. Prior to the era of vaccination in the United States, we had about 500 children every year who died of measles, about 500 a year. After vaccination became introduced in the 60s, that went away. We didn't see measles. Measles declined and the deaths stopped. And now measles is back. As I said, in 2000, measles was considered eradicated from the United States, but it is now back. If we look, we have to remember this is not just an American issue. This is a global problem. This is a global issue. Around the world, measles is still a leading cause of death among children under 5. Before the era of vaccination, there were over 2 million deaths globally every year from measles in children. 2 million every year. Who's at risk for measles? Anyone who's unvaccinated, especially children, and especially medically vulnerable and immunocompromised children. So children with various disorders like mitochondrial disease and muscular dystrophy and other immunocompromised diseases, they're at particular risk. As I said earlier, global eradication is possible, and the World Health Organization is working toward that goal. We can do that, just as we did with smallpox. We got to a 71% rate globally, and then that has fallen off in recent years because of anti-vax activity. It's been estimated that vaccination has prevented in excess of 20 million deaths around the world due to measles. But the incidence of measles around the world is increasing rapidly now in UK, rest of Europe, and in the United States. We're seeing a resurgence of measles. This is directly due to the fall off in the vaccination rate. We must have 95% of the population vaccinated. If we do that, we can move toward eradication of measles. Our vaccination rate is falling off. It's directly due to misinformation from anti-vax groups. So I have a call to action for all of you out there. It is imperative. We must reject the false information coming from the anti-vax movement. We must embrace proven effective vaccinations, which measles is certainly proven effective, 97% effective. That's a spectacular vaccine. We must also abide by the isolation procedures of infection control experts. The measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine, does not cause autism. That is a false association. It's been proven false repeatedly. It took about 10 years to prove that alleged association to be false. That original paper was found to be fraudulent. The author of the paper that suggested that MMR caused autism was convicted of fraud. So there is no chance that the MMR causes autism. Anyone who says that is wrong. If you're unvaccinated, if you've never been vaccinated against measles, or your children aren't vaccinated, get them vaccinated now. One dose will give you 92% protection, and that benefit kicks in pretty quickly. We must isolate all unvaccinated people who have been exposed for 21 days. It's inconvenient? Yes. Subacute sclerosing panencephalitis is even more inconvenient. Isolate. Do not send your children to school if they're unvaccinated and they were exposed to measles. You must reject the recommendation, the incorrect recommendation from Florida's Surgeon General. Disregard the politically motivated, wrong advice from unqualified, self-proclaimed experts with fraudulent resumes. Many of the people you see on TV talking to you about how bad vaccines are unqualified. They're not infection specialists. They're not infectious disease doctors. They're not infection control practitioners. Some of them have even false resumes and have never even done any postgraduate medical education. We need to, this is all politically driven. We need to reject this information. Follow the advice of actual experts and protect yourself and your children from measles. I was keeping an eye on the story. We now have an outbreak. Measles is now in 16 states. 41 cases, and if you remember the geometric logarithmic progression, that's likely to spread much greater if we don't act quickly to isolate, quarantine, and vaccinate. So that's basically my message for today. I am happy to entertain any questions or comments while I'm on this podcast.
I got to add myself to this. Okay. Just to remind our audience, this is for education only. Please contact your own physician. But I've been reading up about this area, Dr. PATMAS, and it seems to me that the measles can be pretty bad if you get it. In other words, it's kind of horrible. Blindness can take place. Death can take place. Dementia can take place. So talk to me. Why would someone allow themselves to be contaminated with somebody who has measles? In other words, why would a Florida Surgeon General or any Surgeon General say, hey, it's okay to go intermingle with somebody who has measles? Why would they do that?
You know, that's a question that's hard to wrap one's brain around. It's really hard to fathom. The advice given in Florida by the Surgeon General is so, it has left all of the medical community around the world, the infectious disease community, the infection control community, we've been left aghast at this recommendation. It is so far afield that it's hard to comprehend and wrap one's brain around why they would make this recommendation. But to your larger question, you know, I remember, I was born in the early 1950s. I remember the pre-vaccination era. I was one of the first kids in the country to get polio vaccine, for example, in 1957. But I don't think anybody ever considered, back then people were terrified of polio, measles. The greatest fear a young mother had in the 1950s was that their child might get one of those diseases. And then along came vaccination and the diseases faded away and people forgot about them. So most people today have no idea how bad measles can be. It is true, most children will recover just fine. But, you know, 3 out of 1,000 dying, that doesn't sound like a lot unless one of those 3 happens to be your child or your child left with, a severe neurological compromise. So why would these supposedly knowledgeable people give this advice? This is speculation on my part, but I think this is part of a political strategy. We know that one political party has embraced the anti-vax movement and aligned it with this argument that this is the government, this is an overstepping of government, and they're manipulating the voters with this appeal toward freedom, medical freedom, and resisting the intrusion of the government into your life. Say no to vaccines because that's the government intruding on your life. I'm sorry, but there are times when we have to have restrictions and regulations, why we have speed limits, why you can't hurt other human beings, why you can't drive drunk. We must accept that there are certain limitations on our freedoms, and being vaccinated is a public health concern. Our individual liberties really are superseded by public health. You don't have the right to walk around with an infectious, contagious disease, infect and kill others. That's not an inherent personal liberty. I think it's political.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk about this vaccine because unfortunately, I was also born and got measles because the vaccine hadn't come out.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, they required the schools I went to. It was mandatory. You had to take the vaccine, or frankly, they kick you out of school. And that was a long, long time ago.
Right.
Now, how long has this vaccine been around? Because from what I've seen, it's been pretty effective. It stopped measles. And how long has it been around?
Early 19...
that was developed.
I believe 1962, early 60s.
Okay.
MMR, measles vaccine came out, and it was packaged together with mumps and rubella. So this was the early 60s when this became available. I had measles as a child because I was in the pre-vaccine era. And I have immunity. Once you have measles, if you survive it, you have lifelong immunity. But interestingly, one of the hospitals I work at, I had to have a measles vaccination just a few years ago, even though I have had disease. So I have super duper levels of immunity to measles. But it's been around for a long time, 60 years plus, extremely safe vaccine, highly effective, way better than allowing your children to be exposed to this disease that will make them sick as heck and can kill them.
Right. And why is it that we see people that are scared of vaccines? In other words, from what I understand, the science behind it, they basically replicate the cell to allow it to have defensive pathogens that are in there. And hence, when you get contaminated, you already have built-in immunity. Okay, so to me, it all sounded good. And that's the reason I've had vaccines, because it looks like it works. You're talking about a 97% effective rate. So why would I be scared? Like a lot of people, they're fearful of taking a vaccine. Why is that?
Well, it all started with the study in the early 90s that suggested that autism was related to the measles vaccine. That caused
was quite that Waterman?
That was Wakefield. Andrew Wakefield.
Okay, Wakefield study.
Published that paper. If you go back and read the paper, it's an awful paper, and it was retracted by the journal. He was eventually tried and convicted of fraud in UK and banned from the scientific and medical community in UK. He's still out and about, still touting this false association. It took a long time to refute that paper. People were like perplexed by that, and they really looked at it, and they tried very hard to see if there was an association. And it took about 10 years. Finally, we put that to rest. There is no association between autism and measles vaccination. But it sparked an industry, what I call the anti-vaccine movement. And the anti-vaccine movement is very popular, and they have a lot of airtime. They have people on TV all the time. And they're bombarding the public with misinformation. They do it on social media. They do it on cable news. And people, about half of the United States right now harbors, there's a very good study from Kaiser Family Foundation that showed that about half of the people in the United States harbor significant misinformation. They're misinformed because they've been intentionally misinformed by this anti-vax movement that is doing such harm to public health. So I think
So,
if you're not a doctor, you hear this from somebody you think is legitimate, and even though they may not even have done a residency or be board certified in anything, but they're on TV, they are self-proclaimed most knowledgeable person in the world, and people listen to them because the
right.
politicians are pushing it too.
So what happens is that a fraudulent paper that was done years ago, people are still following it as if it was the Bible. Now,
Yes.
here's what I also understand. The Surgeon General of the state of Florida, is the state I actually am licensed to practice law, so I'm very embarrassed about this gentleman who came from Nigeria, by the way. He wasn't born here in the United States. And he got his position, it looks like, with a lot of money thrown at him. It also looked like, and what I'm saying, lot 600,000 plus full tenure professor at University of Florida. So they're heaping it, and then the current governor, whoever he might be, because the Surgeon General didn't agree with his decision, he dismisses that person and brings in a person who's basically a hatchet man. Now, the tragedy I also see is that some of the other people, and these are legislatures in the great state of Florida, said, well, we're going to listen to the hatchet man because I'm not a doctor. Okay, now here's what gets me. Because I was the Florida State chess champion for 3 years, literally. But there were better chess players than me. You know who they were? The US champions, the top players in the country. And I would defer to them, obviously, as better players. We're talking about a guy who is a Florida Nigerian doctor, saying that he knows more than the medical doctors, the top doctors of the world, the top doctors of the United States. Talk to me. How can a guy who is a medical doctor in Florida be better and more knowledgeable than the top doctors of the world? Tell me how they do that.
So this is, Dr. Ladapo apparently went to Harvard Medical School and did his residency at Beth Israel Deaconess. Those are very good. It's a very good medical school and a very good place to do residency. But he doesn't have training in infectious diseases. He's not board certified, fellowship trained in infectious diseases. He doesn't have the added qualifications that I have, for example, in infection control and hospital epidemiology. I would answer your question this way. To the non-physician out there, just the average person, average patient, when you have cancer, you're going to go to a cancer specialist, right? Someone trained in cancer. If you have heart disease, you're going to go to a heart doctor, a heart specialist. If you're going to have a baby, you're going to go to someone who's trained to deliver babies, an obstetrician or perhaps a family physician with training in maternity. If you have a neurological disorder, you're going to see a neurologist. If you have a rheumatological disorder, you're going to trust the advice of a rheumatologist. If you have an infectious disease, there is a specialty of medicine for infectious diseases. Only infectious fellowship trained and board certified infectious disease doctors are qualified to give advice to patients about serious, complicated infectious diseases. I don't know why it is that infectious disease seems to get disregarded. Everybody else knows they would go to a specialist for their heart or cancer, but yet when it comes to infectious diseases, we have an army of fake experts out there, none of whom are trained in infectious diseases, giving the public advice, and they're giving the wrong advice. Dr. Ladapo is not an infectious disease doctor. He's not an infection control doctor. He should defer to those doctors who are.
Right. Yeah. Deference should be given. And see, this would also got me about his advice. In other words, we're running a disclaimer, as I told you, that this is for educational only. Please consult your own physician, because there could be an incidental case where somebody can't take the vaccine because they have cancer or they have some sort of disease that would actually hurt them. So it's very important. But how can a doctor like him in the state of Florida escape liability? I know Florida has 100,000 licensed attorneys right now. When I was there was only 40,000. These personal injury attorneys, they're going to get all over this. If some kid goes and dies because of Dr. Lapato and the advice of the state of Florida, how can they say, hey, we're not liable, when they're frankly giving medical advice to individuals without disclaimers? Talk.
You know, I'm not a lawyer. You are, but
Yeah.
you know what I know about this is that it's all in the context of the defined physician-patient relationship. If you're delivering advice to a specific patient and you say, don't isolate your child, send your child to school, you could have liability because it's in the context of a physician-patient relationship. But when it's a public official, it's not in the context it's of a physician. So the medical boards are loath to do anything about it. There was another incident where a very famous doctor was giving all kinds of bad advice around the world that people followed, and the medical board in his state would not hold him accountable for that. So we really do have a problem where a physician, if I tell you as a specific patient something wrong, I'm responsible. But if I were just to get on TV and say something in general, then you can. What's next? Are doctors going to start advising people not to get rabies prophylaxis if they get bit by a rabid dog? How ridiculous does this become? So
Mhm.
I really do think we have to, physicians need to be held accountable for the advice they give, whether it's to an individual patient or whether it's public advice. Wrong medical information is wrong medical information. And a doctor who knowingly gives out wrong medical information should be held accountable. I would urge consumers to take the advice of doctors who are trained in whatever condition they're concerned about. If you have a heart problem, see a cardiologist. Cancer, see an oncologist. Infection, take the advice of an infectious disease doctor.
Mhm. Yeah, and the thing is that then you would be moving in the right direction. But does anybody ever explain to individuals about the horrors of this disease? In other words, like when we looked at the measles, this was a horrible thing to get. In other words, blindness was a real possibility, and I was actually isolated in a dark room for days on end because of potential going blind. Do people know how horrible this disease really is?
No, they don't. And most even doctors don't know. Young doctors today don't know because they've never seen it.
Because never had it. Yes, it was.
I a few years ago, I did see a child with measles, and I recognized the rash because I grew up in that era. But the patient was sent to me by another doctor who didn't know what the rash was, didn't recognize it. So we're in this sort of twilight zone where, because of the success of vaccination in nearly eradicating the disease permanently from the Americas. We had it eradicated for almost 20 years now, it's back. But because of that, people have forgotten. They didn't either, they weren't alive back then. So the severity of these childhood infectious diseases, whether it's measles, mumps, rubella, pertussis, people are ignorant about how bad these diseases were because they weren't alive back then. But those of us who were remember. And it's so I don't think we ever imagined that the success of the vaccines would lead decades later to complacency and a laissez-faire ignorance about these diseases. It's very, very unfortunate, and I fear that this current measles outbreak, especially because of the bad advice given in Florida, is going to spark a much larger outbreak, and children will get sick, and hopefully no one will lose a child over this. But I fear that will happen, and I hope the voters of Florida hold their elected officials accountable for this bad outcome. I just read today. It seems that Florida may not be forthright about how many cases they're actually seeing. They may be suppressing that information. I can't verify that, but that there is at least one report today that Florida may not be telling the truth about how many cases they're seeing. But it will spread quickly beyond Florida. It's already in 16 states. I think unless we do the right thing, we're going to see a much bigger measles outbreak.
Right. And people do need to know about it. By the way, Florida does have government in the sunshine. So eventually an attorney, like I said, these people don't know. Attorneys will get a hold of plaintiff's attorney, and they're going to get that information out. So we're going to stay tuned, especially on this show. So I do want to thank our viewers and thank Dr. Patmos for medical and science, especially measles. And we'll see you next week on a new hot topic. Hopefully it won't be this, but it might be. If this becomes big, then we're going to be talking about it. We'll see you next week on Medicine Science.
Thank you all. And thank you, Nick, and stay healthy.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Bye-bye.